Hi, welcome to the second part of our Guide to Language Paper 1. So today we're going to be focusing on Section B. 2 seconds. Today we're going to be focusing on Section B, which is question 5. Now question 5 is worth 50% of the marks for the entire paper, so 40 out of 80. This is split down into two key components. 24 marks are available for AO5, which is your content and organisation. So essentially, how well put together is your answer? Does it make sense? Is it engaging? Does it use a variety of different language devices, sentence construction, etc., paragraph control, things like that? Really an awareness of the reader whilst you are planning and writing. And then the second part of this is AO6, which is your technical accuracy. So 16 marks available for spelling, punctuation, grammar. We always tend to say that the best thing to do here is to allow yourself around about 40 to 45 minutes for this question. You should probably spend at least 10 minutes planning. Now this could be in any number of ways. You may wish to plan out your order of paragraphs. You may want to start off with mind maps to organise your ideas, thinking about forward planning for the types of language devices that you may be using in terms of vocabulary or sentence stems, etc., to really get your ideas together. Once you've then finished writing, you should always allow yourself around 5 minutes to check, read over, ensure that your work is fluent, that it's engaging, that you haven't made any simple errors in terms of things like spelling or missed punctuation, etc., etc. And this is really important because you do find that in the exam situation, under those kind of writing pressures, that sometimes we make very simple errors which can be spotted and rectified during that checking time. Now, as it says here, your aim is to produce something which is fluent and engaging, and that word engaging is really significant because when you look at the mark scheme for question 5, the higher levels are based around how aware you are of the reader. So when you're writing a story, for example, you won't necessarily try and write a whole story. It could just be a scene or part of a chapter, and it would be about how do you draw the reader in? Do you use little tricks to engage them in terms of your organisation, in terms of the way that you put your ideas across, in terms of your flair, etc. So when we're looking at that level of engagement, it's thinking about, is this something which would be entertaining to read, as opposed to, is this something which has been written in an exam just for the sake of producing a piece of work? Okay, so before we look at a typical question and some ideas, just a few things which have worked well previously and things which usually we've seen potentially could be improved for students. So this first point in the what went wells is using a structure which gives a sense of direction. So you could start off with a story that begins in the present and then has a flashback to a point in time and then has another flashback and then comes back to the present, so that we have almost like a full circle effect to the writing. You may also wish to do something along the lines of thinking, well, if I'm going to write a third person narrative, I might have my first paragraph could be looking at the setting or the location, my second paragraph could then introduce the protagonist, and then my third paragraph could be introducing something significant, so maybe a point of focus. So to give you an idea of how that could work, we could say if you were to write a story which was atmospheric and maybe linked to something like Gothic horror, then you might have the first paragraph describing the setting of a churchyard, maybe at night, and thinking about the mist and the fog and the sounds of the woodlands around and the ambient moonlight casting shadows across the ground. So you could build up that sense of tension in the first paragraph. Then your second paragraph could be the arrival of your protagonist. Now, if you're thinking of somewhere like that where it's quite scary and quite spooky, if your protagonist was then introduced as maybe a young child who was on their own, that would add to the tension because we would feel fearful, thinking, well, we've established the scene and then this character appears and you think, oh, well, they probably shouldn't be there, therefore we feel a sense of fear and a sense of dread, so we're drawing the reader in. If we have the same setting, so with the graveyard and the churchyard at night, and then the character was introduced and it was someone who was all dressed in black and seemed to be walking through the graveyard like they were looking for something, it would still be effective, but it would create a very different atmosphere. So we're thinking about the organisation of the ideas of that we're putting across, as opposed to just what's the story about. Now that's why we think about not necessarily writing a whole story. Often, as I said previously, we would look at something being maybe a key scene, or the opening of a story is quite an effective way, because the examiners are not looking for something which is necessarily whole and complete. They're just looking for something which works on its own. Now, the second point there is to use a wide range of punctuation, sentence structures and vocabulary. A couple of easy tips for this is to think about things like the VCOP system. If you're not familiar with that, your teacher should be able to give you some guidance on it or give you a handout. You may have seen it on displays around classrooms, etc. So vocabulary, connectives, openers and punctuation. The key one really for me there is to not just think about the language you use in terms of the vocab, but also how you start your sentences. It's very easy to start every sentence with they or he or then without having much variation. If you can vary your sentence openers, so the first word of each sentence, to include things like starting with verbs, so rather than he was running, you could just put running through the woods, rather than he was running through the woods, comma, he tripped and fell. It gives a greater sense of action. So varying your sentence structures by using openers is one thing. Also using simple, compound and complex sentences, mixing them up, having long rolling sentences to develop a sense of movement, and then short snappy sentences, maybe even down to sort of one word sentences to bring the reader back with a sudden sharp shock. Now, in terms of the description, because obviously you've got narrative or description on question 5, in terms of the description, if you're given a picture and it says write a description suggested by, or write a description based on this picture, one of the things that people often fall into as a bit of an issue is that you don't have to just describe the picture. You're given the opportunity to use it as a bit of a springboard. So take inspiration from a small part of it and then really develop that. Or something along the lines of, for example, what we're going to look at in a moment is it might give you a picture of an old person and it might say, well, write a description of a person as suggested by this picture. So you could describe the person in the picture, but you could say, well, actually, I don't want to describe an old man with a beard. I would like to focus on an elderly lady. Or you might say, I want to describe a character who's almost ancient, like some kind of mythological character who's timeless and been around for millennia. So then you could take some examples of the picture and elaborate on them, but you are not constrained to only describe what you are given. It's just there to give you something to bounce off of. Usually with this type of writing, we're saying you should aim for around 2 to 3 sides of writing, but remember it is about that quality as opposed to the quantity. So don't feel that you have to pour out page after page after page, because 2 pages which are really well thought out, well planned and well organised will probably be much better than if you just stream off 4 pages without really thinking about it. So that's why we say make sure you plan in advance. Make sure you check your working through, your work through afterwards to ensure that clarity is there and you've not dropped marks for simple technical errors. A couple of points which usually can be improved: technical accuracy. Full stops and capital letters are the basics, but also thinking about just trying to make sure that you don't have misplaced apostrophes for possession or contractions, and thinking about how to try and incorporate high level punctuation. Take risks, use a colon to introduce a list, for example, or use a semicolon to link together 2 sentences which are similar. And even if you don't get it right every time, just by taking those chances, you give your chance a much greater, give yourself a greater chance, of getting to those higher levels. One thing to focus on is cliches. Don't write something which is stereotypical. Don't write something which is just full of, endless zombies and gore, because it's the kind of thing the examiner will have read hundreds of times before. You want to do something which maybe is a little bit more subtle, focusing on characterization and development of tension as opposed to lots of explosions and people getting dismembered, etc., etc. Nothing to say there's anything wrong with these stories, but they usually require a decent amount of flair, and sometimes in the exam there is not time to develop them to their greatest potential. This point here, making sure that you've got paragraphs, as you can see in the even better if, writing in paragraphs and include a word / one word sentence, so or a 1 word paragraph, for example, for effect. And as it says at the bottom, the final point here before we look at an example, small sections of a bigger story work well. So practicing your story writing over the course of your preparation for the examinations through year 10 and year 11, giving yourself a chance to try out different styles, different structures, so that you're confident by the time you get in, means that really you're going to be much better prepared for this type of exercise. I would say that if you can have a 4 or 5 paragraph template which you've used numerous times, and you've varied the characters and the location and what's going on, but it gives you that confidence because of how you are organising your writing, that's a really good way to build up your confidence in preparation for the examination if you find this kind of writing difficult. Okay, so if we look at this example, thinking a description of an old person is suggested by the picture, or write a story about a time when things turned out unexpectedly. This is a very typical rubric for a question 5 on paper 1. Now you can see the picture there of the gentleman, and if you were to look at him and think, right, I'm going to describe the old person as suggested by the picture, if you were taking the picture at face value, you could be looking at the creases around his eyes. You could be looking at maybe his kind of wispy, wiry eyebrows. You might want to look at the colour of his beard and the fact that you can hardly even see his mouth. Then focusing on his eyes and how he looks like there's a level of sort of sadness or melancholy to it. You might want to pick up on sort of the age spots and the freckles. Maybe focus on his clothes. You might imagine what his hair looks like just out of shot. So there's lots of different things to focus on. But remember, when you're looking at description, one of the key things to think about is firstly using multiple different senses, not just focusing on what you can see, but thinking about the texture of things, how things might sound, how things might feel, how things might even smell, for example. You know, don't necessarily just describe how you think an old person might smell, but it's about bringing those different aspects in as best as possible. Now, as I said previously, you don't have to just look at the picture, you can use it as a bit of a springboard. But we'll look at this example here. So, lost, confused, lonely. Now, you think about that as a really effective way of opening, and then the fact that it's also got a colon brings in those extra points. So, lost, confused, lonely. His dark eyes, like 2 small buttons, peered out of the window, searching longingly for something, anything that would liberate him from his elderly self. Now, the thing I like about that opening is it's a really nice long rolling sentence. You've got various different adjectives have been brought into it as well. We've got the use of the higher level punctuation, and it draws you in straight away. You can visualize the character. You can really imagine the person who's being described. Okay, let's carry on. Finally, they fixated on the space in front of him, staring at nothing. Melancholy and sadness etched itself onto every aspect of his face. Every wrinkle told of an experience or event in his life that was now nothing but a memory. Oh, the things he had seen. Now notice the shift there from that long, rolling, descriptive paragraph to really emphasise the character and bring them to life, then oh, the things he had seen. By that being shorter and being quite an isolated paragraph, it acts as a transition. Now, the things he had seen, we could then go into all the things that he'd seen, but what you'll see in this next paragraph is we're now thinking about, he's thinking of the things he's seen, so we're talking about the way that he starts to react and think. His lip curled upwards as some faint recollection of something that he once found humorous made its way back briefly into his mind before being whisked away once more, never to be thought of again. He wouldn't miss it. He wouldn't even remember it. He hadn't always been like this. Years ago. Now you can see that we've got a couple of things to focus on here. I hope you can just see my cursor. So here we've got the repetition of he wouldn't miss it, he wouldn't even remember it, he hadn't always been like this. So we've got 3 sentences which are quite similar and all develop on the point, but by repeating that structure it's quite effective. Now if every single sentence throughout this started with he, so he was lost, he was confused, he was lonely, his dark eyes, he fixated on the space in front of him, it wouldn't be as effective. But what we've got here is a mixture of different openers, as I said before. So lost, finally, melancholy, and then we've got his lip curled upwards. So this paragraph being more focused on the character and what he's doing as opposed to speaking about him as more of an observer, it works because of the variation in the first word of the sentences. Okay, so what I think you should do is to take some time to plan out your own second paragraph in response to what we've seen. Have a go at maybe sort of 2 or 3 minutes of planning. Write a paragraph which tries to take into account all those different things, and then once you've finished it, read it through, check it for any errors, and think about, well, what works well, what have you learned in terms of the exercise, and what could you improve next time. Now, as I said previously, the section B gives you the option to do narrative or descriptive on most papers. There is the chance that it will give you 2 narratives or 2 descriptives, but usually you will be given a choice. It's worth ensuring that you are reasonably confident with both types of writing. Some students find it quite easy to come up with ideas for stories because they can imagine different scenes and they can play scenes out in their heads, whereas some people find it more difficult to develop a narrative, so they prefer to do the descriptive. Remember, with the descriptive writing, there doesn't have to be a plot, and you can shift back and forth between different areas of focus without having to worry too much about there being that fluency or consistency in your writing. With the story, you have to have more awareness of why you're organising your writing in the way that you are, how you're drawing attention to certain things at certain times, etc. But a lot of this comes down to practice, and the best thing you can do over the course of the next year or so is just to have a go regularly at doing short pieces of writing, giving yourself half hour, 40 minutes to look at a typical question, plan out an answer, have a go at writing it, read it over, check it, try and make improvements, and then speak to your teacher or ask your friends to have a look at your work and give each other some feedback to develop it. Okay, well, I hope you found this useful, and if there's anything else, then obviously you can speak to your teachers, or you can speak to me directly, or drop me an email, and we will go from there. Okay, so just to finish up, our final point is going to be having a look at some level descriptors for the marking, just so we can understand what you need to do to reach a certain level. You can use this to look at your own answers before you submit it to a teacher, but also use it as a point of reference for the future. So what you're looking at here is that through level 1 to 2 to 3 and to 4, it's always the same things that they're focusing on, and it's just about the level of confidence that you show. So level 1, you can see simple awareness of register, simple language devices, simple structure. Level 2, a sustained attempt to match the purpose to the audience or the register, a conscious use of vocabulary. So really saying you've clearly tried to use some language for effect. Level 3, we're just seeing that to be more consistent. So it's the same points, but it's just about how consistently you are hitting these markers to really put those ideas together. And the same thing comes with spelling. Accurate basic spelling, some accurate spelling, genuinely accurate spelling, highly accurate spelling. If you want to use high-level vocabulary but you're not sure how to spell it, you are much better off taking the risk and using more impressive vocabulary and maybe getting it a little bit wrong than only ever using basic words, because you will limit yourself. If you only use basic words because you're worried about getting more complex words incorrect, you will potentially limit yourself to level 1, level 2. If you take a risk and you make some mistakes, you can push yourself into a level 3 because it's generally accurate, but also you are trying to use those increasingly sophisticated types of vocabulary and phrasing, and there is some level of success with the linguistic devices. So I'm not saying every word has to be insanely complex, complicated, sophisticated and fancy, but take those risks occasionally just to push your writing up to that next level. The next thing being in terms of things like your sentence demarcation, ensuring that you've got consistent use of full stops, your punctuation is effective, that it's reasonably accurate, and again, just by taking those risks and trying to use some different levels of punctuation, such as a colon or a semicolon, making sure that you've used apostrophes, bringing in rhetorical questions, etc. Just by doing that, you'll automatically push yourself up into a higher level, even if you are not massively confident on it. More than anything though, if you want to improve your levels of accuracy, it comes down to practice, and regular reading will also help you hugely when it comes to firstly having a wider vocabulary to use, but also your organisation and your structure of your writing. Okay, so once you've had a go and you've looked at the levels and you've checked your work over, just think about which aspects you feel more confident with for question 5 and which areas maybe you need to focus on in a little bit more detail. Once you've done that, if you could rate yourself for this question and think about why you've given yourself that rating, that'd be very useful for your future reference. Okay, well, I hope you found this useful, and if there's anything else you need, then please check over the notes, have a go at the questions, and then speak to your teacher, or alternatively, drop me an email or speak to me at your earliest opportunity. Okay, thank you.